Okay, well, thanks everyone. Jason, thank you so much for inviting me to be here this week. You guys have put together an amazing program. Just the kind of long-term outlook that you have for this is so cool and really inspiring. So congratulations on making this happen. So Jason asked me to talk about gender and the experience of war. What I'm going to focus on mainly is how gender ideas and constructs incorporated women and affected the experiences of women in wartime. I'm focusing on women because Amy this afternoon is going to focus on men and masculinity. So that's why I chose to focus primarily on women. And so, we could spend a lot of time talking about what gender is, but basically what you kind of put in your mind when I'm talking about gender, what I mean are things like characteristics, behaviors, and roles that a society or culture has assigned to men and women. So they're changing, they're fluid, they're different depending on the society or culture we're talking about. They're not fixed to people. And again, they kind of change over time. Although one of the things that's sort of interesting to see when we look at US history from a military perspective is how kind of certain particular ideas about gender do remain in various forms over the course of the, I'm really focusing on the second half of the 20th century, but we can see this if we take it farther back. I'm not going to focus much on race or sexuality. Sexuality will come up a little bit. I'm not focusing primarily on those two categories, but I do want to acknowledge that gender is often directly connected to ideas about race and sexuality. And we can actually see those intersections during wartime because of the way in which race, gender, and sexuality, those categories are used to define power. So again, I think looking at wartime context is actually a really interesting way to get at a society's ideas about gender, race, sexuality. American women have served in all of the wars that the United States, that the country has had since its founding. At first, mostly unofficial. But then civilians were mobilized, civilian women were mobilized as nurses. In fact, George Washington, during the American Revolution, requested that civilian women, I should say, be brought in to work as nurses in the Continental Army as part of medical support so that men would be free to serve in battle as needed, doing less work as medics. So Dorothea Dix was the superintendent of female nurses of the Union Army. So this was a civilian volunteer nurse corps. And then, so you see the picture here is Florence Nightingale. It's a lady with the lamp. I think this image is really interesting because it's here where we can kind of see the gender conventions that are applied to nurses. Really not only in the 19th century, but we see this traveling up through the Vietnam War. I'm talking about nurses in the Vietnam War. But, this concept of the angel of mercy or the lady with the lamp, the idea that women are inherently caregivers, and that's a role that they could play, and it's appropriate for them to play that in wartime. So because of that, it was considered to be, an appropriate way to mobilize women into service in a military context in the 19th century, early 20th century, as a nurse. Women are caregivers, men are fighters. You can see that kind of gender dichotomy there. And that's an idea that, again, has played out in various ways, but has kind of remained constant at least into the mid to late 20th century. What that image, the lady with the lamp painting, conceals is the disturbing realities of what women nurses have seen and done in war. And I'll say more about this later, coming from some interviews that I've done with Vietnam War era nurses. But it's not pretty. They're dealing with bloody, dying men who are losing limbs, men who are fighting off infections from infected wounds and those sorts of things. It's not serene and calm. But because of this kind of image, there are moments where women nurses felt that they had to portray this kind of calm presence. And then there are all sorts of implications for their own mental health and that after their wartime service. And again, I'll say more about that when I get to the Vietnam War. So it's World War II and the massive need for personnel in World War II that open up the door to large-scale mobilization of women. I will just go back and say that Congress established the Army Nurse Corps in 1901, but personnel were not considered military and they didn't receive military benefits. So we can see moments of kind of government involvement in bringing women officially into military service, but still considering them to be civilians. But it's in World War II that this begins to change again because of the massive need for personnel, the massive mobilization. Something more than 16 million Americans served in the U.S. Armed Forces during World War II. So it really is a large-scale mobilization, including of women. And so the idea is that, okay, how can we free up men for combat? And one of the things we can do is bring in women to work in jobs that are not related to combat. Clerical work, office type work, intelligence, communication, other types of non-combat specialties. In 1943, the Army created what at that time was called the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps, and then it was fairly quickly renamed the Women's Army Corps. The Navy created a women's auxiliary that was called Women Accepted for Volunteer Emergency Service, or WAVES. And then for the Air Corps, the Women's Air Force Service Pilots, or WASP. WACs and WAVES were, again, clerical, communications, intelligence, kind of office jobs. Again, jobs that would have been cast as, appropriately feminine in the civilian world. A woman could work in an office. She could, do those sorts of things. These are the kind of jobs that were handed off to women. Again, from the minds of Army and Navy leadership, if we put a woman behind this desk, then that man who would have been there, we can put into a combat unit. Again, it's a major need for troops. And then WASP was a civilian women's aviation organization, which was attached to the Army Air Force to free up male pilots for combat missions. So women would fly planes that were in non-combat, that had non-combat functions for the Army. About 150,000 American women served in the Women's Army Corps in World War II. About 100,000 WAVES served, and then smaller numbers in the other services. About 13,000 women served in the Coast Guard Women's Auxiliary. About 20,000 served in the Marine Reserves. I don't know how many WASPs. I actually should have found that statistic. I don't have that. But, in service.
It's about 1,000.
Okay, thank you. About 1,000. The U.S. military was segregated at that time and during World War II, and that was also the case for the Women's Army Corps. This is an image of the 688th is what they called their unit, but the 6888th Central Postal Battalion. This was an all-black, all-female unit that served overseas in World War II. It was the only one that was all-black, all-female to serve overseas. They were in England. I think they were also in France, but their job was to process mail for troops. And the woman up there, her name is Millie Dunvasey. She was one of the, she served in that unit. And she found an interview that had been done with her. She talked about how the women in that unit saw their role as helping the morale of troops over there, because if they could process mail and get it to soldiers, then soldiers could be connected to home and feel that, that could help build their morale. And so they saw themselves in part as emphasizing, focusing on the morale of soldiers. And that was important to them in terms of the work that they did. This is just an image of WACS training at the WAC. The original WAC detachment was at Fort McClellan in Anniston, Alabama. This is a later picture, 1955, but they trained at the WAC battalion there. There was major public opposition to women being mobilized into service in World War II. And it fell into kind of two categories. The responses were either that if women were going into the military, it meant that they were either lesbians or loose women. And this kind of language is repeated in lots of different ways. Letters to the editor of newspapers, surveys that were done of just average American citizens, and kind of social observers, and those sorts of things. That these are the two types of women that would go into the military. And so by mobilizing women, this is just providing an opportunity for those two expressions of what would have been at that time be considered to be kind of disordered femininity to be expressed and to kind of have this sort of outlet. And in fact, again, I said I'm not going to really focus on sexuality, but there's a historian named John D'Amelio, who some of you might know. He wrote a book about the various types of gay and lesbian organizing beginning in 1945, or beginning in the 1940s, and he refers to World War II as a national coming out party because of the massive mobilization of young Americans and then the kind of segregating them onto military posts. So they're being removed from their communities, kind of the watchful eyes of their parents and family members. And so he argues that some of the earliest gay and lesbian networks that were developed in the military because of that mobilization of World War II. But the public really kind of picked up on that. And so these are, two types of disordered femininity is the arguments that they're making. The good women don't serve in the military. And if they choose to, they're going against conventional femininity because the military is for men. Now, the Army tried to challenge this by emphasizing that jobs in the Women's Army Corps were support positions. And that is an appropriate expression of femininity, that women are supposed to support their men. And that's what the WAC was doing. They're supporting their fighting men. The work was feminine and respectable. They're not being armed. They're not going out into the field. They're, again, primarily on a post, kind of in jobs that would have been considered to be appropriately feminine. It was just another way of supporting the war effort, like buying war bonds or having a victory garden. That's appropriate for women to do. Going into the Women's Army Corps is just another example of that. And that's how the Army tried to kind of counter some of that negative public opinion about women being mobilized into service. And the Army also emphasized the non-combat nature of the Women's Army Corps, so women weren't challenging men for jobs that men were supposed to be doing, which was to protect the country, protect national security, fight the war, and all of that. Women were doing support, which was appropriate. In 1948, President Truman signed the Women's Armed Services Integration Act, which made women permanent members of and allowed for women to be made permanent members of the armed services. So Women's Army Corps, WAVES, and WASP and that were at that time during World War II meant to be temporary in the context of that mobilization for the war. But in 48, President Truman signed the Women's Armed Services Integration Act, allowing for women to be permanent members of the armed services. They'd be subject to military authority and entitled to veterans benefits, but it expressly prohibited women from serving in combat units and limited the number of women who could join to about 2% of each branch's total membership. So women could be mobilized, but definitely putting a limit on the number of women who were mobilized. There actually was limited women's participation in the Korean War. I feel like the Korean War is jumped over in so many aspects of U.S. history. So I wanted to at least mention the Korean War. The Army had a hard time recruiting, women into the Army during the Korean War. Not quite sure why that was the case. I think a couple of reasons. One, Americans in general were war weary after World War II. Not as much sense of like this kind of patriotic involvement in helping the war effort. On the home front, there were, what we would kind of call calls for return to normalcy. And one of the ways in which that was expressed was men and women going back into what was considered to be kind of mainstream traditional gender roles. Men going out of the home to get jobs, women staying at home, having children, keeping the household, which was jarring for some women in general, even if they hadn't served in the military, because civilian women had gone out into the workforce in larger numbers, particularly middle class. There have always been working women. Not to say that women didn't work and then suddenly in World War II they all went out into the workforce. There have always been working women. But for much larger mobilization of women going into factory jobs and those sorts of things during World War II, men were going off to fight. And so there's a shift once troops redeploy home that in order to make soldiers' lives normal because of all of the horrors and things that they had seen in war, we need to go back to those kinds of traditional constructs of family and that. And so men and women are both kind of going into that. So I think that too might have played a role in why there was limited participation by women in the Korean War. Again, I don't have a definitive answer on why that is. I think it would be an interesting project. But what I do know is that the Army struggled to recruit women during that conflict. So the next major conflict where we see a significant mobilization of American women into the military is the Vietnam War. There was deficient record keeping, government record keeping during the Vietnam War. So we can't say exactly how many women served in the U.S. military, but we have I think what today are considered to be fairly accurate range of numbers, maybe about 8,000 to 10,000 women, mostly nurses and mostly in the Army Nurse Corps, served in Vietnam. And then after that, the numbers are much lower. About 700 women served in the Women's Army Corps, and then smaller numbers beyond that serving in the other branches of service, Marines, Navy, women serving as nurses on kind of flight nurses, and also nurses on Navy ships. I'll show some pictures of that in just a minute. And then there are also civilian roles. I'll talk about a particular Red Cross program, just to kind of get at some of the gender ideas that informed these women's experiences. And we're kind of coming out of the sort of mainstream gender beliefs in the U.S. at the time. So I've interviewed a number of women. I've interviewed actually quite a few women who served in Vietnam, nurses, Women's Army Corps personnel, and this Red Cross program that I'm going to talk about. And one of the things that became really clear to me in doing my interviews is the disconnect between the ideas that they were told in terms of how they were supposed to behave, what they were meant to symbolize in Vietnam, and then the reality of their actual experiences being at war, which, really just kind of by definition tore apart the kind of gender binary that they were supposed to be operating on. So this is a picture of the U.S. Women's Army Corps handing out uniforms to South Vietnam's Women's Armed Forces Corps in 1964. The Women's Armed Forces Corps was kind of the South Vietnamese counterpart to the U.S. Women's Army Corps. So the South Vietnamese Army created a women's auxiliary to do kind of similar things that the U.S. Women's Army Corps did. It was to serve in non-combat kind of support roles. So Vietnamese women would do clerical work for the South Vietnamese Army. They would do healthcare. One of the differences for South Vietnamese women is that they could go where soldiers and their families were. Really, they'd kind of go out into the field. The war was being fought on their soil, and families would often try to move as close as they could to where their husband or father or brother, or whatever the case may be, was stationed. And so because of that, you would have families, children, elderly parents, and that living fairly close to battlegrounds. And so some members of the WAFC, is how kind of abbreviate Women's Armed Forces Corps, would minister to those families. So they would do kind of social work with families and that sort of thing. But the U.S. Women's Armed Forces, U.S. Women's Army Corps worked with the WAFC, especially in the beginning, early 60s, to kind of train them for their roles. The Army actually began deploying nurses to Saigon in 1956, even earlier than this, to train Vietnamese nurses. So 1956, this is before the U.S. has a major ground force presence in Vietnam. So 1965 is the first time that the U.S. deploys significant numbers of ground troops to Vietnam. Almost 10 years before that, the U.S. is sending nurses to train members of the Army Nurse Corps to train Vietnamese nurses. The Army Nurse Corps did try to recruit male nurses, but had a difficult time doing that. And over the course of the Vietnam War, men comprised less than 30% of Army nurses in Vietnam, which illustrates the staying power of the kind of gendered imagery of nursing, which, we could take it back to that picture of the lady with the lamp from the 19th century. If you're interested in the issue of the Army Nurse Corps and how gender kind of shaped the imagery of that, recruitment efforts and whatnot, and his historian by the name of Kara Buick wrote what really is kind of in my opinion, the definitive book on the Army Nurse Corps. It's called Officer Nurse Woman. She's a professor at TCU, and she really kind of dives deep into the Army Nurse Corps and looks at it from a gender lens. Her analysis looks at it from a gender lens. It's a great book. But she talks about, one of the things that was striking to me about this book is that she actually talks about the Army's efforts to recruit men and how difficult that was because of the gendered ideas surrounding nursing. and caregiving in wartime. So American nurses in Vietnam had the double duty of caring for the physical wounds of wounded soldiers, wounded servicemen, and also offering emotional comfort. So they're doing two things in terms of the way that they are caring for troops in Vietnam. And the nurses that I've interviewed just tell these harrowing stories about the experiences that they had doing that, and kind of doing both at the same time. So I've talked to nurses who explain how they would kind of, they'd find themselves holding a soldier as he's taking his last breaths and calling out for his parents and dying, or having to break the news to a soldier that his leg has been amputated. He'll never, walk again, or he'll never walk again due to his injuries. I had a nurse tell me that she was caring for a patient who had been severely, severely burned, and him asking her, do you think my girlfriend will still love me when I get back? And she just was talking about how she had to compose herself and just kind of pat his hand and say, yes, she's going to love you, and then walk out of the room and burst into tears because of, his severe disfigurement and what that was going to mean for the rest of his life. I read an oral history with another nurse who had worked in an ER in a hospital in Los Angeles. And so she saw a lot of gunshot wounds, other kinds of violent cases coming into the ER. So thinking that she'd kind of seen, pretty much all that she could see. Well, she joined the Army Nurse Corps and she went to Vietnam, and she had to take care of a patient who had been severely burned and crying out in pain. And as she went to take off one of his boots, his foot came off with it. And how, again, she had to just she couldn't scream out in fear when that occurred. She had to hold that in and continue taking care of this patient. And so the mental and emotional strain on nurses in Vietnam is something that has really struck me as I've talked to nurses and learned about their experiences. And compounded with just what they're seeing, the fact that they have to keep it together because what they believe that they're supposed to be this emotional support for soldiers too. Again, not just taking care of their physical needs, but also being something to them that is comforting. And so I talked to nurses, and I've read oral histories with nurses who would talk about how they would wear perfume to work because some of the soldiers, that was comforting to them, and maybe it reminded them of the perfume their mom wore or their girlfriend back home or whatever. Talked to a nurse who said she'd always put a ribbon in, if she had a ponytail or a braid, she'd put a ribbon in it because she knew that to some of the soldiers that she was taking care of, that was this kind of reminder of home, to try to look pretty. Again, but what that meant was they're thinking about how they could present themselves to take care of the emotions and the emotional needs of male troops without any way to have their emotional needs and mental needs taken care of based on what they're seeing. So, talk to nurses who would say how when their shifts would end, they would go directly to the officers' club, as women nurses were officers, and drink, turn to whatever kind of release they could just to drown those mental and the mental and emotional anguish that they were having, and they didn't have any outlet for that, way that they had to compartmentalize or suppress their own emotions. So I've thought about this a lot, the kind of this concept of combat and what it means to be in combat. And nurses were certainly not in combat in that they weren't taking up arms and going into a fight, although U.S. hospitals were bombing targets and were bombed during the Vietnam War. But they saw the horrifying consequences of combat up close and personal in the way that someone in the Women's Army Corps wouldn't necessarily see that. But they saw combat up close and personal on a daily basis as they were caring for their patients. And so I think, one of the, and I'm going to talk about this later, but one of the kind of hot button issues in kind of the American conversation about women in the military has been service and combat, And there's, and I'm going to get to it, but I think we would probably do some good by talking about what combat is and acknowledging the experiences of nurses who see combat even though they're not in it. And so I kind of talk about this concept of like seeing combat tends to mean like you go out, you're in the moment, you're fighting, you're with a combat unit. But nurses saw combat in a lot of ways, and that they're caring for the consequences of it, and that had a long-term effects on the mental health of nurses after they came home after the Vietnam War. So this is a quote from a nurse I interviewed. Her name was Paula Quinlan. She was an Army nurse who served at the 27th Surgical Hospital in Chu Lai in Vietnam. She said, "You learn real soon that you can't fall apart over every 19-year-old you send home in a body bag." I mean, that's to get to that point of not falling apart every time you send a 19-year-old home in a body bag had to take a lot of, mental exercise and emotional exercise to be able to do that. But again, because of the gendered nature of nursing and caregiving, especially in a wartime context, these women had to do that. Hospital shifts were typically 12-hour shifts. Most nurses worked 6 days a week. And this is in Vietnam in particular. I interviewed another nurse. She was an Air Force flight nurse. Her name was Linda Pugsley. And she said, I was aware that that Americans generally saw women as maternal. And so it didn't surprise her that she ended up as a nurse, as a nurse, she ended up being kind of a stand-in for a serviceman's mother or wife. And this is a quote from her. She said, "Sometimes when the young men would be crying, sometimes it was really kind of hard. They'd hold your hand and just cry for their mom or their girlfriend. Sometimes you were the last one they saw and you didn't mind taking that place." So it was a kind of a tough job for some of the nurses to reconcile, that they understood that they were doing something important for these young men, sometimes who were dying. And so they valued that experience, even though it was difficult on them because they didn't have a way to release their emotions and the mental impact on them after the war. So they had to internalize these emotional impacts. And I talked to nurses who had a hard time in readjusting to civilian life, which is a story that I've also heard from American male veterans that I've interviewed from the Vietnam War. So the coming back and not having a difficult time relating to family and friends. Most of the nurses that I talked to, or nurses, Women's Army Corps, Red Cross workers who I've interviewed, didn't talk about being mistreated when they came back from the Vietnam War, but that the people in their lives wanted them to just let it go, move on. Let's go back to, I remember talking to somebody who was like, yeah, my friends all wanted me to just go to the mall and hang out. And I was like, how could I even think about shopping after, the things that I saw over there? And so that for them, the expectation that they could just get over it and forget was what was traumatizing in their experience. Even if they didn't come home to being spat upon at airports, those kinds of stories that we hear from some male Vietnam War veterans. But they also had difficulty readjusting into civilian life. Okay, so again, like I said, we don't really think of women as being in combat, but American women in the Vietnam War were in danger. Like I said, hospitals were target for attacks and were attacked during the war, as were other places where American service personnel and civilians lived in South Vietnam. On Christmas Eve in 1964, National Liberation Front, or Viet Cong guerrillas, drove a car loaded with explosives into the parking lot of what at that time was the Brinks Hotel in downtown Saigon. It was bachelor officers' quarters. The U.S. Army had made it into bachelor officers' quarters in central Saigon. Today it's a Hyatt, but there's a monument to that moment right in front of it. It's a really interesting monument that shows it's made out of stone, and it shows a vehicle that's exploding. There's some words on it that say what happened. But Viet Cong drove a car loaded with explosives into the parking lot of the Brinks Hotel. The blast killed 2 U.S. servicemen. And it wounded more than 60 American personnel and Vietnamese civilians who were either working at the hotel or just in the vicinity. Among the wounded were 4 U.S. Navy nurses. So 3 of the 4 are pictured in this image here. And in January of 1965, January 9th, 1965, the nurses received Purple Hearts. This is something that we don't hear about. It's really not been made part of the Vietnam War story, is that there are these 3 female Navy nurses who received Purple Hearts because they were caring for U.S. servicemen in the attack. They had been injured, but they were caring for U.S. servicemen who had been hurt during the attack. So in the picture, just from left to right, the names of these nurses, it's Lieutenant Barbara Wooster, Lieutenant Ruth Mason, and Lieutenant Junior Grade Ann Darby Reynolds. There's another Lieutenant, Frances Crumpton, who's not in the picture, but it was 4 of them, and they received Purple Hearts. This picture was taken at the awards ceremony that was held at the U.S. Navy headquarters in Saigon. And so again, this is part of the Vietnam War, broader Vietnam War narrative that we just don't know about. I mean, I came upon this story like a couple of years ago, and I've been studying the Vietnam War at this point for almost 20 years. Like seriously studying it from grad school on. It's been almost 20 years. And I didn't know about this until just a couple of years ago, as I stumbled upon this picture somehow. I don't even remember how I found it. Female nurses aren't part of that collective memory. We know about male servicemen who received Purple Hearts in Vietnam, but female nurses aren't part of that collective memory. And this is because of gender constructions. Popular memory doesn't have women in combat zones, even though they were. I will say I do think that's changing, and there is more of a acknowledgement and awareness of dangerous roles that American women have played in wartime. I think part of that has to do with the fact of women being visible in the current U.S. military. So I do think that there is more awareness now on these sorts of issues. Okay, even though I'm talking mostly about women in the U.S. military, I do want to talk about one Red Cross program that mobilized civilian women to go to Vietnam because of the gender performance that they were instructed to play as part of their job in Vietnam. And so this is the Red Cross Supplemental Recreational Activities Overseas program, SRAO, or they were referred to kind of colloquially as donut dollies. And this is a reference back to Red Cross women in World War I and World War II serving coffee and donuts to U.S. troops in Europe. So donut dollies. And the women that I talked to, they embraced the name donut dollies. It's not, it wasn't something that was considered to be pejorative or anything like that. The SRAO program was actually first launched during Korea. So this, again, there were some American women who went to Korea. First launched during the Korean War. As a way to send Red Cross women to provide entertainment for soldiers. So playing games with them, organizing shows on post and those sorts of things. And then in 1965, the Defense Department asked the Red Cross to mobilize SRAO again for deployment to Vietnam. And this was because defense officials were worried about U.S. troops getting bored and turning to vice in Vietnam. So there's already a recognition in 65 that the U.S. might be in Vietnam for a while, and that the war fighting was such that troops might find themselves at either, whether it's large posts or fire support bases or whatever the case may be, just kind of sitting around waiting for something to happen. And defense officials were worried that morale would decline, troops would turn to prostitution, alcohol, drugs, and those sorts of things. And so they thought, well, if we send some Red Cross women out to hang out with these troops, they won't turn to vice. And so SRAO, or the Donut Dollies, were in Vietnam from 65 to 72. So 72 troops are leaving Vietnam. And the Red Cross sent about 700 women total over the course of those years to Vietnam to work as Donut Dollies. To be in the program, you had to be single and you had to have a college degree. So that put the Donut Dollies at 3 or 4 years older than the average age of a U.S. serviceman in Vietnam, which was about 18. So these women tended to be like 22, 23 when they went there. So you had to be single, you had to have a college degree. And you were told, and the Red Cross training materials told women, and their Red Cross training sessions, told the women who had went into the program that they were meant to be, they were meant to symbolize a touch of home. So donut dollies I interviewed, and in fact, one wrote a memoir, I think, called A Touch of Home. Or there was a documentary made about donut dollies too, and that might have been called A Touch of Home also. But they were to remind soldiers of home. And in doing that, the idea is that they would boost their morale. So they were meant to symbolize kind of the girl next door. So an innocent girlfriend, and innocence is important in this for the Red Cross. A girlfriend, your sister, your mom, a kind of beloved friend. They weren't meant to be sexual. So, and there were all kinds of interesting criteria that were given to the women in terms of how they could and couldn't look. Like you weren't supposed to wear bright red lipstick. You weren't supposed to wear your hair down. Like if you had long hair, you were supposed to wear it in a ponytail or get kind of like a shorter haircut. Those sorts of things. But yet their uniforms, and you can kind of see in these two pictures, I'll come back to these, I got a couple more, were these kind of powder blue dresses, and the skirts were, they're not super short, but they're kind of short. And I talked to several donut dollies who would say, if a helicopter landed and you weren't thinking, that skirt was flying up. So they were like, we were told that we were supposed to not be sexual and to not, kind of appeal to that side of heterosexual masculinity, but we're going out there in these short dresses. Give us some combat fatigues or something. Like, give us some pants and some boots, because a lot of the women would be going out to fire support bases, kind of in groups of two, to work with troops out there. So some of them were on larger bases, but they just talked about how impractical also these uniforms were. It's very hot and humid in South Vietnam year-round. It never gets cool there, and it's dusty, it's dirty. They were meant to wear pantyhose also with the dresses. I think some stopped doing that after a while, but it's just impractical. And in the minds of some of them, really kind of contradictory to what they were told they were supposed to symbolize to soldiers. So they were supposed to do things like play board games with them, organize kind of group games, sing-alongs, have parties. On some of the bigger bases, there'd be libraries or gyms, and so they'd kind of hang out in there and just sit around and talk to soldiers. One of the donut dollies that I talked to, she said that what she'll always remember is like lukewarm or even just warm orange soda, because her group, one of the things that they did a lot, they'd fill up cups with orange soda and just hand it out to soldiers as they came around, because it was hot, so it was just always warm. And she said that was something that always triggered a memory of Vietnam for her. She talked about having to do this sometimes as troops are coming back from a fight and they're, in shock. Members of their unit have died, and the donut dollies are supposed to be smiling and, chatty and handing them these cups of warm orange soda, which seemed just totally incongruous to what, the soldiers had just experienced. But that was the job that they were told to do by the Red Cross. Like nurses, the donut dollies, while, at least the ones that I talked to, while they understood the contradictions in the program and the way, what they were supposed to be like, and that they felt that they were doing something important for soldiers, that, some soldiers appreciated it, maybe some didn't or didn't care. Actually, one donut dolly that I interviewed said that, she's like, honestly, sending two women in short skirts to a base where men haven't been able to interact with a woman for who knows how long. It's like, we were probably in danger to a certain degree. And she's like, I don't know that we helped morale at all. She's like, if I'm being honest, sending some prostitutes there might have been the better option. So, they understood the contradictions and the, some of the issues with the program as it was defined. But they also understood or hoped in any case that they were doing something that was helpful to soldiers. But they also had the experience, like some nurses did, of having to compartmentalize their emotions and mental state because of what they were seeing. So they might get to know a group of soldiers for a few days and then come to find out later that half that unit was wiped out in a in a battle. I interviewed one donut dolly who told me a story about how she had brought a guitar with her on her deployment and got to know a soldier who also played guitar. They'd sit around and play songs, and she told me his name was Michael. And then she learned later that he had been killed. And she said, after I learned that Michael was dead, I stopped learning the names of the soldiers that I was working with. She's like, I know that there are guys on the wall, the Vietnam Wall, that I know, but I don't know because I didn't learn their names. And she said that was how I could keep doing this job, is, you know, showing up every day with a smile on my face and trying to comfort these men who are fighting and, you know, give them something to think about other than war. And the only way that I could continue to do my job is to stop getting close to these guys. So she's like, I stopped learning names. And I've always remembered that. I mean, it's been a long, I've probably interviewed her like 18 years ago. She's since passed away, actually. But I will never forget that story. Is that drove home to me so clearly how difficult this kind of job was, in that you've got to be an emotional support for soldiers in war, and yet you don't have any emotional support. You know, they talk to each other and that sort of thing. And, you know, because donut dollies weren't military, they also didn't, you know, afterward, they didn't have the networks to go to, you know, that veterans did. And they, you know, some of the donut dollies I talked to, actually some of the nurses that I talked to were, you know, felt kind of conflicted when they came back, you know, as women who had served in the military because of the unpopularity of the Vietnam War, especially later in the conflict at home, and the ideas within the women's movement that women should be for peace and men do war, that because they had been in the military or had been over there, in the case of donut dollies, that they didn't feel welcome in women's groups. And I'm sure that there are women who did feel comfortable in those groups. I'm just giving an example of some of the people that I talked to, is that they felt like they didn't really know where they fit. They had been in the war, and even if they, you know, I talked to someone who said, by the time I was done, I was totally disagreed with the war, but I didn't feel like there was a space for me in the anti-war movement because I was a woman who had been there, you know, especially in the case of those who had joined the military. It was they're not drafted. The draft came up yesterday, but they're not. The women who went to Vietnam went because they chose to go. Now, some of the nurses that I talked to said that they, you know, they're in nursing school, and the Army recruiters for the Army Nurse Corps are coming to the nursing schools and tell them, look, we'll cover your schooling. These are working class women by and large. We'll cover your schooling. You join the Army, you won't have to go to Vietnam. And then they do, and turns out, actually, we need you in Vietnam. So, to be fair, not every woman who was in the military in Vietnam fully chose to be there. Now, I did talk to some women who said, and I've read oral histories done with women who said, you know, I wanted to be there because I wanted to do my part. I wanted to help my guys, like men who were my age. In fact, I read an oral history that had been done with an African-American nurse, and she said, I know that black men are being disproportionately put into combat units relative to population numbers, and I want to go over there and help them. And so she enlisted in the Army Nurse Corps and chose to go to Vietnam because she wanted to minister to black soldiers. But again, the women weren't drafted, and so again, the popular image, at least from their perspective, was, you know, we chose to be there, so we don't really fit in the anti-war movement. We don't fit in the women's movement. Okay. So since the Vietnam War, so the U.S. ends the draft. We have not had a draft since 1973. Without a draft, the U.S. Armed Forces realized that they need to recruit people into the services. And so this is a recruitment ad, I think it's from 1980. Yeah, 1980 recruitment ad. And you could see men and women are in there. So now the branches of the service they go through a period where they're kind of rebranding themselves as a place where you can go to get job training, to get your education paid for, get a career. You know, and these are non-gendered experiences. Again, because the services they see that they need to recruit people without a draft. In 1976, the service academies began admitting women. And in 1978, the Women's Army Corps was dissolved, and so now servicemen, they go into the Army. The major hot button issue, and there have been issues about women in the military from Vietnam to now, but the major hot button issue in recent years has been women in combat. So in December of 1915, at that time Secretary of Defense Ash Carter announced that the Army would open combat specialties to women. And there was a backlash response to that, which and we're in 2015, and so but this reveals that even then, there's deeply ingrained in the minds of many Americans ideas about who should fight wars, who can fight wars, and that sort of thing. Now, the language that is used to to oppose women serving in combat doesn't often explicitly mention women or femininity, although sometimes it does. But words like lethality, unit cohesion, morale, and in fact, these words, it's interesting to look at this over the history of U.S. military integration, because lethality, unit cohesion, morale, these words were all used to oppose the integration of African Americans into the military in the 1940s. And then 48 was when racial integration in the military happened. These same terms were used to oppose the integration of gays and lesbians into the military. So Don't Ask, Don't Tell was repealed in 2010, 2011. But same issues, harm lethality, harm unit cohesion, harm morale, same words used to oppose the integration of openly transgender personnel and women. So it's just been interesting to see how the same ideas have been applied to different contexts of integration. But in the case of women in combat, these are some of the words that were used. So embedded in the language is that the presence of women in units, especially in combat, harms unit cohesion, harms lethality, harms morale. And opponents say this is based on primal differences between men and women, and that there can be sexual tension between men and women, and that is incompatible with unit cohesion. So we can understand this perspective. I mean, we can find truth in some of those things. So we can understand that perspective, but it's a perspective that's based on gender stereotypes and sexual assumptions. So the assumption that men and women serving in the same unit are going to end up wanting to have sex with each other, and that harms unit cohesion. Or a male soldier is going to see his female comrade in a battle and want to save her instead of fighting, and then that's going to harm the mission, and those sorts of things. So we can understand the perspective, but it's based on gender stereotypes and assumptions about sexuality. Opposition to women in combat is also tied to opposition to women being drafted. So that's something that's come up in like within the last year. There's been conversations about the draft because the primary purpose of a draft is to fill combat units. So to replace troops who were killed or wounded in battle. And so if there's a draft and women are drafted, then they'll be put into combat units. So concerns about women having to sign up for the selective service will have led opponents of that to say, but if they are drafted, then they're going to wind up in combat units, which that's not as much of an issue now because women are in combat issues, as combat units as of late 2015, early 2016. And in fact, women have been attached to combat units even before that. So this is a picture of a U.S. Army female engagement team in Afghanistan in 2010. So female engagement teams were created and were attached to combat units in Afghanistan and in Iraq to be able to interact with local women who, because of cultural issues, couldn't, sit down and talk with a male soldier. If it's a male who's not a member of their family or kin, but they could talk to women. So female engagement teams would go into villages and talk to women about what their village needs, do health care for women and children, and those sorts of things. And some of these female engagement teams were attached to combat units. So women have been attached to, they're in close contact with with combat units. In 2015 officially can be in combat. But the connection between the draft, opposition to the draft, or opposition to women registering for the draft has been connected to an opposition to women serving in combat. Now, interestingly, although maybe this totally makes sense, so maybe it's not interesting, but opposition to women in combat and to women having to register for the draft is not confined to one political ideology. Feminists have been divided on these issues for decades. The National Organization for Women has advocated for women to be able to serve in combat and to register for the draft. The idea for now is that combat experience is required for military career advancement, and now emphasizes equality of opportunity. And so women need to have equal access to the same opportunities as men. That's the thinking of now, of the National Organization for Women. And now also argued that women should be subject to the draft if it's ever reinstated for the same reasons. This sense of equality of opportunity and putting men and women on the same plane. But other feminists have argued that the military and war are completely antithetical to womanhood. That the military embodies the patriarchy, and wars are expressions of power and dominance that parallel men's subjugation of women. And so therefore, feminists must dismantle the violent militaristic systems. This is what other feminists are saying about women in the military, women in combat, and so on. And so that if you as a woman aspire to equal access within the military, then you're part of the problem. You're part of this larger problem that feminists should be trying to dismantle. And feminists in this line of thinking say that women and men are not the same, they've never been the same, and nor should they be. And so it's interesting to see how debates about women in the U.S. military have kind of created strange bedfellows across the political spectrum, and how all of these attitudes are informed by gender constructions, by ideas about who men and women are, what they can and should do, how they should relate to one another, what they should and shouldn't do in wartime. And again, I think studying war is a really interesting way to get at how a society or a culture understands gender, understands what men and women should be doing. So I just want to show you, these are just images that I think are really interesting, that I found at various points in my research on these issues, but some of which kind of led me to my interest in looking at gender in the Vietnam War. So this is a page out of the M16 Rifle Maintenance and Operation Manual that was published, I think this is from 1968. But you see that the magazine is made into a female called Maggie, and it talks about kind of putting her together and all of this. And then there's a woman that kind of leads the soldier who's reading this through the process. So there's other images of this throughout the booklet, and she kind of leads them through the process of how to take care of your rifle. There's a part, I've got it in here, yeah, how to strip your baby. When I was in grad school, actually, I stumbled upon this in I went to Wisconsin. It was Wisconsin State Historical Society. It had a collection of, I don't even remember what the collection was, but I found this, and this was what got me thinking, okay, there's something that's very significant regarding gender that's happening in this Vietnam War context, and I want to know more, but, because this was published by the Army. This is from the U.S. government printing office.
It's actually good luck to name your rifle.
Yeah, those of you who are veterans in the room, this is probably not surprising to you. When I teach a class that's called Women in War. It's actually Gender in War, but the title of the class is Women in War. My students who are veterans or who are active duty, they totally get it. None of what I tell them really is a surprise. They learn about different contexts, but the ideas make sense to them. And then this was a cartoon in Army Times. The Vietnam War, it's sometime in the late 60s. I don't remember the exact date, but the words on the bottom, the caption says, so it's a chaplain and then a donut dolly, Red Cross. My child, let me prepare you. You will find it an extremely difficult task trying to boost the morale here. So the idea is like the chaplain is like, it's so hard for me to boost the morale, but then this very buxom woman, he's thinking that she'll have difficulty boosting morale. I think it's kind of, tongue in cheek that, morale will totally be boosted, as soon as the soldiers see this woman. And then this, so the Pocket Guide to Vietnam, the State Department, Defense Department, and State Department published these booklets, and there was one for, I don't know how many countries, but for many countries in the world, beginning in the 50s, and going on into, I don't know the last time that they were published, but I was struck by this one because the image of Vietnam is this pretty, kind of teenage-ish looking young woman in an ao dai, which is the traditional Vietnamese dress, riding a bicycle. And that's the symbol of Vietnam for Americans. And then I won't really get into it here, but I found gendered language, very explicit gendered language in presidential conversations, policymaking documents, and that Kennedy documents and Lyndon Johnson documents regarding South Vietnam, so referring to South Vietnam as a kind of damsel that needs to be saved. Referring to the first president of South Vietnam, Ngo Dinh Diem, as being led around by the apron strings, kind of casting him as effeminate, and the U.S. needed to come in and, in this kind of masculine way and make that right. But this was also one of those kind of random finds that really got me thinking about the role of gender in how Americans thought about Vietnam and the U.S. relationship to it. So this is just a picture of Madame Ngo Dinh Nhu, who was the sister-in-law of Ngo Dinh Diem, the first president of South Vietnam. And she was really kind of the public face of South Vietnam and really kind of outspoken, very brash and forward in her behavior, and kind of challenged the idea of the submissive Asian woman, which is a trope that informed American thinking about Asia, not going back long before Vietnam. And there's a lot of coverage of her by U.S. news media from the mid-50s until the assassination of Ngo Dinh Diem and her husband Ngo Dinh Nhu in November of 1963. And it's interesting to see how the coverage of her changes as U.S. relations begin to kind of deteriorate with the government of South Vietnam. So in the late 50s, she's portrayed as this model of modern womanhood and by extension, the kind of modernity that will exist in South Vietnam when it's an independent nation under the tutelage of the United States. So the Ngo family is Catholic, so there'd be pictures of her kind of praying at church, and she's married, she has children. Her background, her family had escaped the Viet Minh, which was the independence movement prior to what became the National Liberation Front, or Viet Cong. And they escaped Viet Minh and were hiding out in the countryside and kind of making their way from place to place until they eventually got to Saigon. She was like a young girl, teenager when this occurred. But she was held up first as this model of kind of modern womanhood that would be part of South Vietnam. But then as relations began to deteriorate between the U.S. and South Vietnam in the kind of 61-ish, so into that, media coverage began to cast her as a problem. So probably what she's most famous for is when there was a monk who immolated himself in the middle of a busy intersection in Saigon. She referred to it as a barbecue. And she said, she went on TV and said something to the effect of, if these monks want to barbecue themselves, let them. And that was published all over the world. And what it looked to like to the U.S. is, okay, she's making us look bad because we're backing this regime that's saying that about its own people. It's talking so, dismissively about what had happened. And so she began to be kind of cast as this outspoken threat to security and someone who was out of touch with the majority of Vietnamese people and all of those sorts of things. But I found it interesting that she's kind of the image that's in U.S. media, and then how she's cast changes. So no longer is she this symbol of modern womanhood, she's now this outspoken, dangerous person. She's like, so now she's the dragon lady, which is that's the trope that's used to talk about a dangerous, a dangerous Asian woman. This is the last thing, and then I'll wrap up. One other thing that I found that really kind of drove home the gendered connection to how Americans thought about the Vietnam War. I found these two collections of I don't know how to describe them except to call them soldier folklore. So like funny poem or meant to be humorous poems, cartoons, and that sort of thing, written by a pseudonym or a person's under a pseudonym. This is the cover of one of them. Ken Melvin apparently is a pseudonym, but cartoons, limericks, and other diversions of GI Vietnam. And there are images like this all through this. So Vietnamese women, very sexualized, with the idea that their sexuality is dangerous to American servicemen. So I go back to this one where I said, the caption under that says, "Be nice, Cuthbert. Where could I be hiding grenades?" Because there was kind of a large trend of folklore, may or may not have been grounded in reality, of Vietnamese women harming men, especially sexually. So if a soldier hires a Vietnamese prostitute, then she's gonna, she'll try to kill him during their transaction. Also in all sorts of really violent ways. And so that was a kind of a thread in sort of soldier folklore during the Vietnam War, is how you have to be careful with Vietnamese prostitutes because really they're VC who are out to kill you. Or worse, they're out to maim your manhood. And so this is just one of the limericks that are in one of those books that I found that, again, very clearly kind of use sexuality and gender to demonize Vietnamese women. And then this one. So if you could probably tell that those are grenades over her breasts. And then her quote balloon says, "You dinky Dow GI." So dinky Dow is crazy. "You dinky Dow GI, what give you idea I Viet Cong girl?" Again, but that's part of this trope of like these attractive Vietnamese women that are trying to get us to take them home or to come home with them are really just out to kill us. And it's actually in this where you see the intersection of race, gender, and sexuality. So, okay, I'll end there, and I'm happy to take any questions.